Every so often, I feel I have to talk about my subject, which is theology. And uh, there's two subjects which have come up today. I'm going to deal with both of them, actually, probably in two different videos. The first one is about the speculation that is beginning to buzz around the internet that the picture by Jonathan Yeo of King Charles is a picture of the Antichrist, and this is nonsense. The buzz around the internet is simply the buzz of uninformed speculation. And it's disturbing partly because the terminology is so vague, the terminology of the Antichrist itself. And at the same time, it's both vague and specific. And where does it all come from? We think we know what or who the Antichrist is because we've seen the films, Rosemary's Baby and so on. And we think this picture by Jonathan Yeo somehow gives us a vision of that dark figure, much informed by the illustrations of that spectacular artist, Gustave Doré, of Dante's Divine Comedy. But it's all nonsense, of course. The picture may be bad, but it's not demonic. There's a haunted picture, in fact, in one of the Ghostbuster movies that reminds me of the Jonathan Yeo painting. I think it's a picture of Attila the Hun, and it sort of comes to life. And I think, there, it might remind us of that, but that's not demonic either. The Antichrist, people talk about this with such authority, but it's not biblical. There are some references. There are two references to the Antichrist in the Bible, and I'll deal with those. They're the only two explicit references, and they come from the letter of John, right at the end of the New Testament. But there are implicit references of a seven-headed beast, a sort of king rat figure in the book of Revelations in chapters 13 and 17. There's also apocalyptic imagery in the book of Daniel because there were varieties of eschatological adversaries in Jewish literature long before Christianity came along, the anti-Messiah. The figure of the Antichrist itself comes from a 10th century monk called Adso, who significantly has the same name as the novice in the who accompanies Sean Connery through The Name of the Rose. That's a novel, if you remember, drenched in the occult and drenched with esoteric jokes about millenarianism, a little bit like Foucault's Pendulum, which is a much better book which came after it by Umberto Eco. And Adso built on snippets from Irenaeus and Hippolytus, who'd already fused the beast in Revelations with 2 Thessalonians 2, which warns about a man of lawlessness whose coming is heralded by signs and wonders. And in this scenario, the man of lawlessness not only makes himself the object of worship, but actually takes his seat in the temple of God. This in turn led to speculation that the Antichrist might rebuild the temple, since the temple had been destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, more than a century before Irenaeus and Hippolytus wrote their speculation about the Antichrist. But the Antichrist of John is nothing like that. He's a denier, a negator, a substitute for Christ, the pseudo-Christos, the false Messiah, predicted in Matthew 24:24, in Mark 13:6. There are many who say, I am he. It's not one person who challenges the primacy of Jesus, but many. And mostly it's about doubt. It's about the personal struggle, as well as the cosmic struggle between good and evil in all of us. In other words, it comes closer than anything else to the Islamic concept of the greater jihad, the struggle within ourselves between good and evil, and therefore it's only marginally apocalyptic, but not in Adso's hands. Adso, he wrote this letter to the Queen of France and summarizes all the ancient traditions about the Antichrist. It's a textbook of the apocalyptic. or actually better still, it's an action picture for the Middle Ages. It's hagiography, the history of the saints reversed, a comprehensive story written for a popular, gullible audience, and it still has that audience in its hands, in its talons, and added to this is the link between the Adso text and the rise of medieval anti-Semitism, because the Antichrist is presented as the inverted twin of Christ and therefore assumed to be Jewish. There are two traditions. There's the Jewish Antichrist, and then there's the Antichrist who is the spawn of the church. We'll come to that. It coincides with the first wave of medieval anti-Semitism as the Crusades drew knights towards the Holy Land to redeem Jerusalem from the Muslim invaders, and there was confusion, of course, within sort of, because these people were simple. A confusion between heretics, Jews, and Muslims. This was a civilization that did not write. The only people who wrote, the only people who read were the clerics, who were only too happy to mix things up and foment some form of distraction from their greedy acquisition. And the idea that the Antichrist is Jewish turns up in art as well as in the texts. And the idea of the Antichrist, the alternative version of the Antichrist comes from Hildegard of Bingen. So we've got this tradition in developing in the Middle Ages of hagiography, which is linked to the collection of relics. And you only had to look at the what is that great adaptation on Netflix the other day about the fellow looking for finding relics in an old monastery during the time of Henry VIII. I forget the name now, but Hildegard of Bingen was the Sibyl of the Rhine, a supremely talented woman, a saint, who wrote at least 70 pieces of music and had visions and practiced medicine and painted. But she also popularized the idea of the Antichrist as part of the mythology of the Last Judgment, and particularly in a book called Scivias, The Way of the Lord, which she wrote in about 1140. She thinks of the church as a female figure who gives birth to a monster, and that monster is the Antichrist, designed to persecute Christians and who will pretend to be divine by ascending into the skies like Superman. She wrote, really, the first Superman story, except was it a man? Is it a man? Is it a bird? Is it a plane? No, it's the Antichrist. He's seen at one point as the monstrous head perched on a mountain and then cast down by God. And she spawns a tradition of anti-Christology, the writings about the Antichrist, the parody of Christ's life, much the same as Philip Pullman wrote a story about the twins, Jesus and Christ. It's a fascination with, and a depiction of, a personification of evil in the Antichrist, the agent or the son of Satan on earth, but it is not biblical. And it's something that comes, that is developed quite late in the history of the church. It's the stuff of the omen. It has nothing to do with the figure mentioned in the Epistle of John, chapter 2, verse 18, chapter 4, verse 3. It is the stuff of fantasy and delusion. And the idea that the king's portrait is somehow linked to that nonsense. You would have thought that people who 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 run around the place and say, "Oh, we read the Bible," wouldn't be promoting all this rubbish. But they are some of the most ardent anti-Christ devotees, and it's rubbish. You've got to you've got to look at the theology. You've got to look at the reality. You've got to look at the original words, and you've got to look at this development of fantastic literature. It's Hildegard was the J.K. Rowling of her day, and she was very good at what she did, but she was writing twaddle.